and welcome to Freud and Beyond. Today you're reading with me Shame and Narcissism by Andrew Morrison. Shame for Andrew Morrison is a prominent emotion which enters the therapeutic space in various manifestations such as humiliation, embarrassment, and mortification. It is an emotion which invites the desire to hide, to make oneself small, to, as Morrison puts it, conceal out of a fear of rendering the self unacceptable. At the time he was writing this book, Morrison found there to be a dearth of psychoanalytic literature on shame. There were a few papers being written on it, but shame as an emotion was largely missing as a primary theme. Morrison points out that shame in the clinic is more common than we think, and psychoanalysis has to consider it as an emotion of importance, in a similar manner with which we deal with guilt, in Freud's structural theory. Morrison observes a shift in shame's relation to narcissism in the works of Erikson and Lewis, where shame was not only a response to an intrapsychic conflict, but also a question of identity and self. Morrison himself puts forth his argument that shame is a crucial dysphoric affect in narcissistic phenomena. It also comes to mind to ask this question, then what is shame? He defines shame as a reflection of feelings about the whole self in failure. It is the feeling of being inferior or inadequate or defective in comparison with others. Shame as an affect is present in issues of low self-esteem and troubled identity formation, while guilt is prominently understood as an active emotion in that it leads to repair and movement. Shame is equated to passivity and inaction. Morrison builds on the idea that shame is a central response to failure in relation to the ego ideal. Freud's 1914 paper on narcissism being an important starting point for our understanding. Shame is about the self and is evoked due to transgressions, being then for Morrison the affective underpinning of narcissistic vulnerability. So for Freud, it was the future notion of superego, which was to overlook narcissistic satisfaction from the ego ideal and measure the ego against it before the subsequent disappearance of the ego ideal into the superego. The tension which resulted from the friction between the superego and the ego ideal was deemed by Freud as guilt, contested by other analysts such as Spears and Morrison to be in actuality shame. He cites Sandler's and Schaeffer's work in allowing space for shame to enter the picture as a clinically relevant emotion. Shame was introduced as a response to the failure to attain the shape of the ideal self, that which at any moment is a desired shape of the self as a want to be. In this understanding, shame, in addition to having the possibility of being defensive, is looked at as an affective response to failure. As an affect, Morrison studies shame through the theory of Rick and Jacobson and observes it to be diagnostically pathological and present in narcissistic injury. Instead of conflicts, it hints at the presence of deficiencies. Shame's relation to the ego ideal becomes more prominent in the works of these two analysts as they link it to failures and feelings of vulnerability. Morrison points out the need to also look at object relations. While shame is the affective response to failure and inferiority in relation to the ego ideal, there is an increased focus on the self, leading to narcissism or the libidinal investment of the self. To understand this passage from the self to narcissism, we have to look at the object. Shame is defined in terms of real or fantasied interpersonal interactions, which results in the spectrum of shame-related feelings of failure in relation to internalized object. Morrison read the theories of Sparrow and Kinston, who understand this affect as one of the many responses to impaired object relation, wherein there is a blurring of self-object boundary. Morrison comes to the core of his book in the fourth chapter titled Shame and Narcissism. In his understanding is the desire for uniqueness, a concern to be of sole importance to the other, and shame is the affective response to narcissistic defeat. He introduces his thoughts in the section titled The Dialectic of Narcissism, where shame and narcissism inform each other. He observes there to be a tension between narcissistic grandiosity and desire for perfection on one hand, and on the other, a sense of flawed self, looked at as inferior and inadequate due to its dependence on objects. For Morrison, then this dialectic can be interpersonal and intrasystemic as well, highlighting the need to question the true aim of narcissistic needs.